Hey everyone, we're doing our third survey and overview of the book of First Peter. I've got my friend Jon with me again, Pastor Jon over here drinking his coffee. And
Yes.
we're going to cover brief sections of chapter 3. We're actually not going to cover the whole chapter because we believe some of the context at the end of chapter 3 will actually fit better into chapter number 4. But in chapter number 2, we looked at the importance of being a holy people, a conduct in that way. Same thing with chapter 1, being called to our holiness. And then our submission to authorities. We looked at the government, we looked at a master and servant relationship. And now we're going to come into chapter 3 and see another institution of God where God has called us to act in a way that is right, regardless of what wrong has been done to us. And we're going to walk through some of these imperatives of how do you deal with things when suffering is involved, pain is involved, emotional hurt is involved, or confusion and distress is involved. Does that ever give me a right to not live up to that holy standard that we've been called to back in chapter 1 and chapter 2? And Jon's going to start with the first few verses, and we're going to walk through this together and give you an overview of the chapter.
Yes. And before we jump into chapter 3, you might want to mark this in your Bible. I think this would be helpful. From chapter 2, verse 11 to chapter 4, verse 11, you have this section in First Peter that's dealing with the Christian ethic in light of our living hope. So he lays out in the first chapter this eschatological, if I can say that word, eschatological hope out for us because we've been born again. Here's this lively hope. It's all going to culminate at this. He begins by, or following that, by giving us a command to be holy. And then he begins to lay out this conduct and what it looks like in being honorable in different contexts. And so from chapter 2, verse 11 to chapter 4, verse 11, he's going to fill that out for us in different contexts, like in society, in the home, in the church, and he's going to fill out this Christian ethic. And if you go back to chapter 2, verse 11, it says, "Beloved, I urge you as sojourners and exiles." Now, I want to pause and just say that is language that's reminding us of our identity, but also our living hope. We're not really living for here. We're living for something. So we're sojourning, we're exiles, we're moving that direction. So he reminds us by the very language he uses. And he says to abstain from passions of our flesh. Now, I want you to notice there's two directives that he gives. And actually, these directives we're going to see from chapters 2, verse 11, all the way to chapter 4, verse 11. We're going to see these directives over and over and over again, just in different contexts. The first directive deals with the Christian's integrity. He says, abstain from the passions of your flesh. And he's going to give a reason, which were against your soul. And then he's going to give a second directive that deals with our credibility. So the first one, integrity. The second one deals with our credibility. He says in verse 12, keep your conduct among the Gentiles honorable, so that when they speak against you as evildoers, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day of visitation. So you see this directive of integrity, this directive of being careful about your credibility. And he's going to talk about that in relation to servants. Hey, have integrity because you want to have credibility. He's going to talk about that to us in large in society. And he's also going to talk about that to the wife. He's going to say, hey, in a husband and wife relationship, what does integrity and credibility look like? And that's what he's going to go through in chapter 3. If you look at verse 1, he says, likewise, wives, be subject to your own husbands. Now, I know when we read a verse like this, there's baggage that comes with it, Stephen. Like the moment we start talking about wives being subject to their husbands, I think we tend to go to where men have really abused this verse and have really been harmful and treating women as inferior. And matter of fact, you go back to Bible times, even in the New Testament times, and women were very much treated as inferior. I was doing like a little bit of a study on this, and just generally if you read some early Jewish sources, society was very um, male dominant. They limited women's roles and functions in the home, severely restricting them. They didn't have the rights of inheritance. They didn't have choices of their relationships. They didn't have ability to pursue religious education or fully participate in the synagogues. So their freedom was very restricted. But we've got to make sure that we understand that that was never God's design. God's design is that he created men and women equal. And so there's not man is superior, women are inferior. But because we've heard so much of that, and even in Jewish history, there was that type of feel as well. And in Roman Greco culture, there was that feeling as well. We can tend to come to this and say, this is oppression. But the general idea of this submission to their husbands was a basic respectful deference. It was just, I'm going to respectfully defer to my husband because God has ordained that men are going to lead the home, be the leader of the home, and wives are to submit to that. That doesn't mean that the wife doesn't have leadership there as well, but the buck stops at the man. And he's calling here for a wife to submit to her husband. And then he gives the reasons so that even if some do not obey the word, so they're not Christians, they may be won without a word by the conduct of their wives when they see your respectful and pure conduct. And so here you see the wife's integrity. I'm going to fulfill my God-given role regardless of how he responds. So there's this calmness, there's this confidence. This is the wife sanctifying God in her heart type of a thing. Her trusting God and submitting to her husband at this thing. And you see her integrity, but then you see the credibility being played out in the text as well by her conduct in this way, her having calmness, her having confidence in Jesus and still responding in a way that's respectfully giving deference. This makes way for the gospel to have an impact on her unsaved husband. And then it goes from here and says, hey, this is actually what makes a woman beautiful. It's not necessarily the outside adorning, but this is the inward adorning of her own spirit. And he says, hey, don't focus on the externals, but rather focus on the internals. Now, that's not to say, and obviously there's some women have taken this to the extremes, like I don't wear makeup and I don't look nice. I don't try to look any nicer. I'm going to forget about the outward. I'm going to focus on the inward. This is not against the outward adorning of somebody, of
Right.
a person, but focusing on that internal. And I like what it says here in the text. But let your adorning be the hidden person of the heart, with the imperishable beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit. Now, that doesn't mean that a wife shouldn't talk. She should always be quiet. She shouldn't be boisterous and fun, as some have interpreted. But it basically means having a spirit that's so under the control of God's Spirit. It's calm because of God's sovereignty. And there's that trust factor there. This is the wife submitting herself or sanctifying her own heart before the Lord. And so we see the wife's response. I don't know if you want to give any feedback to that.
No, I was just going to say, I touched on this a little bit in the sermon on Sunday. This is obviously God helping us against our tendencies under chaos. Remember, the background here is trouble, turmoil, distress, losses, panic, and our human intuitions get involved in these scenarios. And God's giving these imperatives through Peter to protect us from ourselves, really. And he knows the tendency of women, he knows the tendency of men. And so he's allowing the wife to be herself, but in a context of safety. And then he'll deal with the man in a second, which you're going to get to. I would also say that to build on what you said, it didn't say a meek and quiet mouth. It said a quiet spirit.
Yes.
And that kind of goes back to the concept he'd mentioned earlier at the end of chapter 2. We have a shepherd and overseer of our soul. So we're entrusting ourselves to the one who does right. We're entrusting ourselves to him who does justly. And in doing that, we're allowing ourselves to be led by our shepherd. So this is a woman who is not conducted by her emotional impulse. Rather, she is calm inwardly because she's being led by the shepherd, by following his
Yes.
imperatives. So I would just add that into that. So women's tendencies, men tendencies. This is a woman who's not led by her tendency. She's under control of her shepherd right now by following this
Right.
imperative. Yeah.
And you think about like how it deals with the outward adorning, like, women are attractive, they're beautiful, and but one of the ways that a woman can really display and actually really be attractive is having this calmness, this confidence in Christ. I mean, if you think about in our world today, beauty is just very much the externals.
Yes.
But man, how attractive it is to see a woman who really knows Jesus, who's confident and calm in Christ. It's a very attractive thing, and that's exactly what Peter is driving at. And then he says this phrase. He says, "For this is how the holy women who hoped in God." So again, this type of calmness and confidence stems from this living hope in God. And he says, used to adorn themselves by submitting to their own husbands, as Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord, and you are her children if you do good and do not fear anything that is frightening. Now, there's a couple of things that this verse brings into our mind, kind of questioning, like, okay, is this calling us to wives to call her husbands Lord? And, that sounds kind of strange, especially in our ears. But this is just an example. We're not supposed to use everything in this passage as like, just like Sarah called Abraham Lord, you're supposed to call your husband Lord. It's just highlighting the fact that Sarah deeply respected Abraham. Now, if you go back and read the narrative, there's times where she didn't. There's times where, as Steve and I were talking beforehand, they were a very dysfunctional family. But you do see through the narrative a respect, and this is what generally we're called to. I do want to highlight this phrase where it says, and you are her children if you do good and do not fear anything that is frightening. Some people call into question this idea of submission to the husband in the context of an abusive relationship. And I think somebody could use this verse wrongly and say, well, even if it's frightening, you still need to submit and just stay there. And I just want you to know that this verse is not saying that at all. If you found yourself in a physically abusive situation, this verse is not saying, hey, just stay in there. By all means, get to a place of safety. But obviously, Abraham wasn't abusive to Sarah. So in this context, it's talking about, and if you go back earlier, here's potentially your husband's unsaved. There might be some things that are frightening there. And he's saying, as a general rule, you need to submit and trust God. Just like later in the text, in 1 Peter 3, it says this in a general context. Let me see if I can find it. In verse 13, it says, now, who is there to harm you if you are zealous for what is good? But even if you should suffer for righteous sake, you will be blessed. Have no fear of them, nor be troubled, but in your heart honor Christ the Lord as holy. That's in a general context. And we can't always dictate what happens to us, but generally as Christians, when we suffer, we're saying, you know what, I'm going to trust God as Lord. I'm going to trust that he's in control. And in a general sense, the wife should do the same thing in that context. Submit as unto the Lord, trust God with the results.
I think it's interesting with the understanding of Sarah. Where did she call him Lord? I believe it's back in Genesis chapter 18. She referred to him as Lord, not to him directly, but when she was told that she would have a child and she laughed, she said, my Lord is old. But what that shows is she had a distress of frustration in her spirit about the promise of God. She was kind of over this promise. She was told this promise through Abraham, you're going to have a child. Years have gone by. She's kind of just now laughing at the promise of God. But even in the midst of her distress and her spirit with God's promise, she still referenced her husband in a reverent way. My Lord is old. So she wasn't even talking to him directly, like coming to, hey, Lord, that's not how she was. She was actually addressing him to another person, which was the angel of the Lord. but she was laughing at the promise of God in her heart because she was dealing with the tension, but she still reverenced her husband even when she was struggling internally with what
Yes.
was going on. So
Yes.
it's not like she walked up to him and said, "Yay, Lord." It was more of she referenced him as that to someone else. Like, I respect him.
Right.
He's an old man, which could have been considered as an insult in of itself. But in this
Right.
passage, compartmentalizing that correctly, even in the context which Sarah said it, it doesn't have the superiority of, abuse or anything like that. The context and the language here, it's not in a context of abuse of any way.
Right. Right. And if there was any question about that, the instruction given to the husband would really clear that up. So at the beginning of chapter 3, you have the word likewise, wives be in subjection. And that's carrying the same language as chapter 2, verse 13, be subject for the Lord's sake. Chapter 2, verse 18, servants be subject. Likewise, wives be subject. And then in verse 7, it says, likewise, husbands. And though it doesn't use the word be subject, there is an aspect of submission here, I think in Ephesians, where before it talks about the role of the husband and wives, it says, submit one to another in the fear of God. And so there is this mutual submission, though the husband is if you want to say, the head or the leader of the home, there is an aspect to where he can show deference as well. And that's what it goes in here. It says, likewise, husbands, live with your wives in an understanding way. I was looking at this phrase, and quite literally, it means living with one's wife knowledgeably. Okay, so it's to really to know how she thinks, to know how she feels, to consider her, to be understanding. And then it fills this out. It says showing honor to the woman as the weaker vessel, which Stephen dived into that in the sermon, which I won't go into great detail, but it's not talking about something that's inferior, but something that was prized. And since they are heirs with you of the grace of life, so that your prayers be not hindered. So this is actually quite a call for husbands. Though the wife has more instruction here, you have verses 1 through 6 to wives. Verse 7 is one verse, but it's a pretty high call. Hey, you better pay attention to your wife, and you better show deference to her in this way, to take care of her. She is a co-heir with you, and if you don't treat her this way, it's going to hinder you. So this is really attacking the culture in that day that would actually suppress women. Where the gospel went, there was a heightening value of women. And here you see they are co-heirs together. This was foreign language to Judaism as well as Roman Greco culture. It would have been foreign to them as well. So here you have the wife's relationship where they need to trust and obey and submit to God. And now you have the husband as well. This is what the Christian ethic looks like, even in a high-pressured scenario.
Yeah, and it goes back to that human tendency again that I brought out in the sermon as well. What's a man's tendency when distress and chaos is going on is to actually neglect his wife's feelings and just make decisions. Just, lock down, fix it all. And in doing so, he can actually run over his wife in the process. And guys are guilty of that. I mean, that's our human tendency. So why is he giving this imperative? Because he knows our tendency is to do the exact opposite of what he just asked them to do. And by doing that and neglecting her, you're not showing honor that you actually value her opinion, her viewpoint. And if you miss the sermon, you can go back and catch that. The guy has one worldview, the girl has another worldview, but when those two worldviews are together, you're joint heirs looking at a bigger picture and making it through the struggle together in unity. Which brings us to our next verse. Finally, all of you have unity of mind. So he's dealt with the relationship to the government. He's dealt with the relationship to a master servant. He's dealt with the relationship with a husband and a wife, and even involves the children. He brings the children up earlier, following the leadership there with the mother, with Sarah and her children implied there. Now, all Christians, whoever you are, have unity of mind. So here's what it comes down to, because when our mindset is right, and we're working together and everybody is doing their part, that's when you actually have a Christian culture. We talk about creating an environment that's gospel centered and all those things, but what does that even look like? It looks like every Christian doing their part. It doesn't matter if you're male or a female or your status in society as a master or a servant or whatever it is. It comes back to, we've got to think right. If we're going to do right, we've got to think right. And so and what that causes us to do is when everybody's doing their part, we're going to become the most selfless group of individuals on the planet. We're not going to be so busy with ourselves and worried about ourselves that we neglect everybody else. We're going to learn attributes like sympathy in verse 8, brotherly love, a tender heart rather than a harsh one, and a humble mind. So can you imagine, John, going through a crisis and you are involved in a community of people who show those character traits of verse 8? That's what we want, isn't it? I mean, isn't that the kind of culture we want for our church and our families? If everybody did that, struggle and external chaos would become a calmer environment because we know it's going to be okay because we're all living like people as having hope. What do you think about that?
No, I think that's excellent, and I think this ties into the next section of verses that this ties into is where it says, "Whoever desires to love life and see good days," which is so interesting in the midst of so much suffering, right? So much suffering, but he's going to say, "I'm going to tell you how you can actually love life at this juncture and see good days." Good days doesn't come from necessarily better circumstances, but good days comes from a mindset that's hooked into, that's anchored to the living hope, and that produces a conduct that's actually free from my circumstance. So regardless of what takes place, I can live a holy life. Regardless of what takes place, I can live honorably. And ultimately, if my joy is connected to the glory of God, I'm free. I'm free. And that's and then you're going to see language following here. And I know you probably get into it. I don't want to steal your thunder, but it says, after he says, see good days, he says, let him keep his tongue from evil and his lips from speaking deceit. And if you go back to chapter 2 and verse 22, it says, talking about Jesus, it says, he committed no sin, neither was there deceit found in his mouth. When he reviled, he did not revile in return. This is obvious that he's saying Jesus was the example of this. Chapter 2, follow in his footsteps. And now he's saying, hey, I want all of you to have the same mind, and I want all of you to follow in his footsteps.
Yeah, and he builds on that with Jesus' example, even in verse 9. Don't repay evil for evil or reviling for reviling, but on the contrary, bless. For this you are called. Called why? Called to the example of Christ. He just said that about Christ earlier in verse 23. When he was reviled, he did not revile in return. Let's just be practical with our audience, John. I mean, if the environment around us is reviling and evil, and then you come into the verse you just quoted in verse number 10 and 11, which he's quoting Psalm 34, verse 12, and all the way to half of verse 16. He says, let him turn away from evil and do good. Let's think about this. If the culture is out of our control and the chaos is something that we cannot control, we can only control us. We can only control our environment, the church realm that we're in, our families. What are we accomplishing by saying, well, the world around me is doing me wrong, so I'm just going to go out and do wrong? Well, let's just talk practically, not even biblically. What did that fix? That didn't create solutions to your problem. You just created two problems. Your culture's a problem, so I'm going to go do evil. Well, that didn't fix anything.
So it's like, man, I hate that these people are so selfish. Oh, I'm going to go be selfish.
Yeah.
Counterintuitive, right?
It doesn't create anything. So what he's saying is control the environment God's called you to. Notice what he said in verse number 9. For this you are called. And it's not that it's an unrewarding life. You may obtain a blessing in this. And then he quotes that desiring good days. Look, he's talking about good days in a bad situation. He's not saying all your problems are going to go away. Just follow this protocol. The whole world will be better. Nero's going to be nice to you. That's not what he's saying. He's saying your environment that you create in your family, in your home, in your church, it can be a good time in the midst of bad times that you can appreciate and enjoy because you're living as people of hope, not people of chaos. And everybody doing their part. You have unity, you have sympathy, you have brotherly love, and you are working counterproductive to your culture. And in doing that, God is pleased. Notice this in verse number 11 at the end. Let him seek peace and pursue it. Why? For the eyes of the Lord are on the righteous. God's watching us. He's watching to see how we do this because he's ready to be a blessing. He wants to be a blessing and so that we could obtain it. And his ears are open to their prayer. Did you notice twice here, John, we have this idea of prayer hindrances or prayers being heard? You saw that with the end of verse number 7. Not being joint heirs in your home leads to a prayer life that's disrupted. Also, not living in a way of hope and in a way that is trying to not do evil with evil, but overcome it with good. That person is actually opening the ears of God to say, okay, he's taking serious my character. He's taking serious my word and my truth and my law. So I'm going to listen to that person because he is in tune with what I am doing. Yeah. And I want to bless that guy, and I want to bless that wife. I want to bless that servant. I want to bless that citizen. I want to bless that church because they are trying to do right despite the circumstances. Isn't that like I said in my sermon, the last thing we want God to do is cut off the prayer line when we're in chaos. That's the last thing we need is God to say, I'm not going to heed their prayers right now because they're responding wrong.
And I think, truthfully, the context of this whole prayers being hindered is in the context of God resisting the proud but gives grace to the humble. He says this in chapter 5. But when I refuse to obey, therefore I refuse to trust God, it's arrogant. I'm being proud. And for a husband to say, I'm going to do my own thing, I'm not going to consider my wife, he's saying, you're arrogant, you're proud. Prayers being hindered. And same for Christians, when we don't just say, you know what, I'm going to trust God, I'm not going to revile, I'm going to trust God with my mind, with my speech, with my actions. This is humility. And God looks at that and says, hey, you're trusting me, you're obeying me. This is humility. God blesses. But where there's pride, he's going to resist.
Yeah, and so then he brings him to his next point. He's like, okay, so God's going to resist if you don't do this, but if you do this, he's going to be open to your prayer, ready to bring a blessing. And then it's like Peter's waiting to finish his statement by quoting Psalm 34, and then it's almost like he knows there's that one skeptic in the crowd who's going to say, but Peter, hold on, what if there's harm done to me for doing the right thing and being zealous about right? So in verse 13, he's almost anticipating an exception clause coming from the crowd. Now, who is there to harm you if you're zealous for what is good? But even if one should suffer for righteousness' sake, you will be blessed. So he's like, look, if you doing right leads to punishment and distress and struggle, don't think that your blessings rob from that. You keep doing right, God's going to bless you. Have no fear of them, nor be troubled. Okay, so here's the people doing them the harm. He's saying, don't be afraid of them. Don't be troubled, but rather in your hearts honor Christ as Lord, as holy. Honor Christ the Lord as holy. And this is a concept that he's bringing out. He's drawing their minds to an Old Testament passage, which he does so frequently here, in Isaiah chapter number 8. And he reads verse 13 to them, but there's a preceding phrase that is connected to what he just said about not fearing them or being troubled. And that goes back to verse 12 of Isaiah 8. Do not fear what they fear, nor be in dread. So there's people saying conspiracy. This people calls conspiracy. He's talking about the trouble and the distress that's coming around the people. He says, but the Lord of hosts, him you shall honor as holy. Now, this is an important statement because he's talking about the Lord here in Isaiah. He's talking about Jehovah. And Peter draws this doctrine to Christ as Jehovah Lord. So there's a textual variant here, and the best manuscripts and the weightiest manuscripts actually insert the word Christ here, and I believe that belongs here. I believe textual criticism gives weight to that. But in your hearts, honor Christ the Lord as holy. Now, in Isaiah, he's saying, honor Jehovah. Well, I think that's important. But what are you doing? You're honoring his character. Honor the Lord as who he is. So he's called you to your holiness in chapter 1. So your life in the midst of this should look like his, because the Lord God is holy. Be holy, for I am holy. Well, who said that? God. Well, who was the expressed image of that? Chapter 2, Jesus Christ. He didn't return revile for revile. He obeyed the Lord, the Father, all the way through the process, even to the point of death. So he was the full embodiment of that. Now Peter's bringing it together. So live your holy life as God is holy. Christ is your example. So honor Christ, the Lord, as holy by existing in this chaos, representing the very one who has saved you, called you, and lived this out himself. And in doing so, be prepared when you live that way holy, because people are going to come up to you and say, now, let me ask you a question. Why are you that way with your wife? Most husbands right now are panicking and bulldozing. And why are you that way with him? Or why are you that way with your husband? Most women would just say, oh, forget him, do your own thing. But you're choosing to stay with this. Or why are you being a citizen so obedient to the laws when the laws are killing your people? Nero's killing you guys. Why are you compliant to the laws of the land? You should be a zealous group of defiance and rebellion. Why are you treating your master that way? He was a jerk to you. Why are you being that way to him? People are going to start asking questions, and now you have an opportunity to share with them the hope. Notice this. For if anyone asks you the reason for the hope, what did they identify in that person? It's not so much that they noticed, oh, she's a great wife, he's a great husband, he's a good citizen, though that's the quality. They recognized a word that drove them to be a good wife, drove them to be a good husband, drove them to be a good servant and citizen. Yes. What is it? Hope. You have something I don't have. Now notice, the people that are particularly asking the questions are the ones who are doing wrong to them. Asks you a reason for the hope that is in you, yet do it with gentleness and respect, having a good conscience, so that when you are slandered, those who revile your good behavior in Christ will be put to shame. They're going to feel dumb for doing wrong to you, because it's like, wow, they're not dishing it back. They're actually doing the opposite. I'm over here. That's what Peter's saying. Who's going to harm you if you're zealous for doing good? But even if you do, count it blessed. At the end of the day, Jesus was killed, and he didn't do it. But at the end of the day, a lot of people in a real sense are going to go, all right, I'm beating this guy up, and he's not hitting me back. What's going on here? Tell me why you're not hitting me back. They're going to become frustrated with you.
Yeah. I mean,
chime in on that.
I just think about, like, I know this is Peter, but I think about Paul in prison at Philippi. It's just like,
yeah. Oh, yeah.
What could you do to hurt the guy? It's like, let's stop preaching Jesus. No, I'm not going to stop preaching Jesus. Well, I'll throw you in prison. What does he do? He preaches Jesus in prison. If you beat him, he's just like, well, you know what? I'm suffering for Jesus' sake. I'm going to rejoice in that. Let's kill him. Yes, I'll see Jesus. And they're like,
win-win.
Oh, we can't. Yeah, you just couldn't do anything. And so there's this calmness and confidence that comes over a Christian who is just governed by God, his glory, and the advancement of his kingdom. And that's what we see. And I was thinking about this when it talks about regarding Christ the Lord as holy. It's regarding him in a very unique sense, particularly that he is the Lord. That, yes, Nero is ruling, but ultimately Christ is ruling. And he has this unique space. And when I really, really believe that Jesus Christ is unique, the God who rules and reigns, it directly impacts my heart and how I treat every relationship, right? And so when I regard Christ as Lord and I set him apart uniquely, it begins to impact my conduct where I become unique. And that's where it says in kind of what you referenced early in First Peter, where it says we are his possessions. We're his, as a different translation would put, his peculiar people, that we should show forth the praise of him who's called us out of darkness into his marvelous light. So another way of saying the same thing that you're saying here, but that's what this passage is getting at. That is the apologia, apologia.
The apologetic.
This is
the apologetic was not even necessarily anything they said. It's what they did. And our greatest apologetic is our life and how we conduct ourselves and doing our part out of obedience. And notice what he says in closing in verse 17. For it's better to suffer for doing good, if that should be God's will, than for doing evil. And we'll touch on this that middle statement. He kind of prefaced it. But at the end of the day, if you do evil, that's going to bring harm. It's going to bring harm. It might not be instant harm, but it's going to bring harm. And his point is, it's better just to do right and suffer for doing right than to do wrong and pay the consequences of wrong. Because doing right produces a blessing. It produces God's prayers, our prayers to God being answered. It produces an environment of tenderness and brother love and sympathy and humility and a culture that people are desirous of, a place of hope. So at the end of the day, the goods outweigh the bads. It's better to suffer for doing good than to take 50 steps backward by doing bad. But then he puts this preface here, and I want you to say something about this, Jon, and then we're going to close it on this. And this is a part where Christians cringe. They hate to hear these words in the verse like this in the scripture. If that should be God's will. We might have to accept the fact that there's times where it's God's will for us to experience suffering. What do you think about that?
Well, I think it's pictured clearly in the gospel. I think we see that Jesus, the whole purpose of his incarnation was to come to this earth, and he was going to pay for the sin of mankind. There was that atonement. There was suffering. So Jesus was called to become a man in order that he may suffer in our place. And man, when we think of the gospel, we think of good news, but we often don't think actually it's a message about suffering. It's a message where Jesus shed his blood, and man, the most blessed message to us is that yes, Jesus died for my sins, but now we are his representatives, and if we're going to follow in his footsteps, doubtful that we would die on a cross. Though Peter historically, died by crucifixion, potentially, upside down. But we're all called to bear that cross, and the end is this hope, this living hope. It's going to culminate at glory. But yeah, it's going to be difficult. But are we willing to be used of God in such a way, like, yes, I'm going to suffer, but it's going to do something so much more impacting. I think about this is a little bit cheesy, but everybody wants to be in shape. They want to, they want to have a good, whether it's physique or just good performance, whatever. In order to get there, it takes a lot of pain. But once you get there, you get in shape, you're like, it was worth it working out every day to get in shape. But that's pain, that's suffering. And really anything in life that we try to reach, there's going to be pain involved. And particularly the case when we stand with the God of the universe against a world that has fallen, and we're going to stand and say, hey, this is the way to life, and there's a clash of worldviews. We should expect there to be some repercussions of that. And you know what? It may be the will of God for us to suffer so that others may come to Christ. This is what it means to represent Jesus. This is what we're called to. We should expect it.
This is our call, and we need to comply with God because he knows us better than we know ourselves. We all need to do our part, create that environment of hope, and in doing so, the church will be the greatest apologetic to a world who has no hope. Thank you so much for watching with us. We'll be covering the last two chapters in the next upcoming days. Grace and peace to you.